Hello, welcome again to Ethics and Leadership. We find ourselves today at the site of Plato's Academy. It's kind of behind me. It's right there, if you can see it. Doesn't look like much today. It's an archaeological site where Plato's school, which was called the Academy, used to sit. And this was where Plato set up this school, in some ways the first university known to human history, that he set up and taught students and prepared them to do philosophy. It is at this location that he taught the great philosopher Aristotle, who we'll be studying next in this course. Unfortunately, there's not much left to it today. But it seems an important site, and this is where we'll do today's discussion. So today we are going to finish up on Plato, and in some ways go through the rest of the Republic. Well, I mean, we won't be able to do all of that, but we'll do as much as we can, focusing on and summarizing the political aspects of Plato's thought, and then asking about his view of human nature, which comes immediately with his political thought in the Republic, because, as we'll see, he sees a perfect parallel between the two. So, let's say something first about where we've come. We've come from the bottom of the cave. We've come from a place of ignorance about Plato, and we've moved up towards knowledge. And we learned a little bit about the marks of a leader as Plato saw them, knowing that the leader is supposed to be marked by knowledge, is supposed to have gone through a painful process in order to gain that knowledge, and that the leader is not someone who will desire power for power's sake. In fact, the leader probably doesn't want to lead, but in some ways may even have to be forced to do so, even if the leader forces themselves. We've looked at the Ring of Gyges, this question about how you would act if you were able to become invisible. What this tells you about your inner self, whether you are in fact good or whether you just like to appear good to other people, and raises questions about how you're motivated, what you are motivated by, right? And gives us a warning about the kinds of leaders that we want. We don't want leaders who are morally troubled, because we're going to give them power, and power gives them the ability not to act good, to do what they most want to do. So you want the leader who is good, and Plato thinks that is the leader who knows the good. We've also gone into the dialogue between Plato and Thrasymachus, and so we've seen them argue about what justice is, whether justice is seeking your own interest, or, as Thrasymachus said, justice is the interest of the stronger, perhaps because it's enforced upon you by someone who is stronger than you. Or whether justice is something else, a kind of appropriate want for things, an appropriateness of wealth, an appropriateness of power, and understanding where the limits are in your life. And we've seen a discussion about what makes people happy, whether it is in fact being the just person, or whether it's being that person that pursues your own interest at the expense of others. That kind of interest that maybe is interested in momentary passions rather than the most fulfilling life that you can go at. So, yes, you should be the philosopher, according to Socrates. You should, in fact, accept limitations and pursue knowledge. Oh, by the way, this is the picture of Plato from a famous painting called The Academy of Athens. This is Plato, and he's pointing up to the sky to make you think about the form of the good, goodness as a kind of abstract idea. The other one, I think, is Lindsay Lohan. I'm not entirely sure, but that, it seems to me, is, and so she represents, obviously, pursuing your passions and your own interest. Not that I don't know that much about Lindsay Lohan, but in this picture, it seemed an accurate representation of what she was doing. So, in any case, okay, so we've come through all of that and we've gathered a lot of information that will help us as we try to make sense of the rest of the Republic. Now, the rest of the Republic is taken up with a set of questions. First, we might look at what would the ideal state look like? So we can think about politics here, and one of the questions we started out with, what is the form of government that we should advocate for? What is the form of government that the philosophers will advocate for? Now, you can think for a moment to yourself, what kind of government would you like? What kind of state would you like? What are the values that that state would embody? If you think for a moment, it's likely that the answers you'll come up with will be quite different from the answers that Plato came up with. Plato was not a modern person. Didn't value particularly modern things and didn't value the kinds of things that modern society tends to value. This doesn't mean necessarily that he was wrong. I don't think we should immediately favor modern society over Plato's views. As a matter of fact, Plato might have something to tell us, might have a fine critique of modern society. But what you think of will probably be things like freedom for the people that are involved in the state, liberty, a focus on property and the protection of property. Perhaps you'll think about equality as well. None of these are central values in Plato's state. So we're going to want to pay attention to what kind of state Plato creates, what he thinks would be the best political state for human beings, and how that might be in tension with what we think or what modernity will produce, because it happens that modernity produced you. So what you think very likely is a product of modern thinking, which we'll get to later in the class. Now, for Plato, the question of what the ideal state looks like overlaps with the question of what the ideal self would look like. We have to remember for Plato that virtue, excellence, is about ordering. And so just as he's interested in the proper order of the state, he's interested in the proper order of the self. Now, as a matter of fact, we could switch off these questions easily in Plato's way of talking to ask, what would the virtuous state look like? Or what would the virtuous self look like? Now, we use virtue to talk about character traits, excellent character traits of people. But for Plato, virtue meant excellence in general. And we could talk about a virtuous state or a virtuous self. And we'll have to remember that for Plato, while virtue equals excellence in general, it also reflects the proper ordering of a thing for its function. So we can think back to the dialogue with Thrasymachus, and we can say, okay, remember how the robber gang, even though it wasn't just, had to have some ordering in order to be successful at robbing. In order to do its function, it had to be properly ordered. Behind Plato's analysis of the doctor and the ship captain and the horseman is the idea that in order to fulfill their functions, they had to be ordered properly. They had to be ordered excellently in accordance with virtue, right? So what we look for in the state and what we look for in the individual when we're looking at ideals are not going to be that different from each other. In each case, what we're going to be looking for is a particular ordering of the self and a particular ordering of the state. So when we ask, what is the ideal state, we're asking, what is the virtuous state? And when we ask, what is the virtuous state, we're asking, what is the excellent state, or what is the proper order in order to fulfill state functions? Okay, now that we've put all of that together, the beginning, some of the things that we've drawn from this point, let's say something about the background of Plato's thought. Well, if you're in America, you probably know a little bit of American history, and you know that all men are created... I can't hear you at this point, so I'm going to assume that you got that right. All men are created equal, according to the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, that means all human beings are created equal. But let's step back from that for a moment, because this is a statement that Plato would have found patently absurd. Are people really created equal with each other? I mean, equal in terms of what? Are they equal in terms of their height? It doesn't seem so, right? I mean, immediately, it's just not so. Some people are taller, some people are shorter, and this will make a difference to how they live their lives. Some people will be better at basketball. Some people won't be as good at basketball. Myself, for instance, I've never been particularly good at basketball, and I blame my genes. In any case, there are other ways in which we're not born equal to each other. Are we born equal in capabilities, intellectual capabilities? Are we born equal in our ability for locomotion even? There are people that we say are born with disabilities, problems that don't allow them to move about or have the intellectual capacities of other people. Now, those are extreme examples, but they make the fundamental point that Plato would have seen as kind of obvious. And in fact, it is empirically obvious. Human beings are not created equal, at least in the sense of their capacities. And this is fundamentally what Plato is concerned about, is the capacities of different people. Because the capacities of different people set them up to function differently from one another. And this means that they should function differently in the ordering of society. Some people will be better suited to some tasks than others, right? Now, each person might have a particular function that they can fulfill, that they perhaps are best at fulfilling. But everybody's function will be different. And we should not assume that each one is due an equal position in the society, or that they are due whatever place in the society they want, simply because they're born as human beings. As a matter of fact, Plato suggests that there are three different places, three different strata of society that people are best suited to occupy. And you saw this in the reading as he talked about the guardians. Now, when you hear that there's three different kinds of people, this might ring a bell in your head. The bell going off again. Lots of bells in this class. The bell should be going off because in the last lecture we talked about three different kinds of motivations for people. We talked about people who will be motivated by material wealth. We talked about people who would be motivated by honor. And we talked about a third strange group. And what Plato said about them in the dialogue was that they would be motivated to lead by the punishment of the alternative. The alternative is that someone worse than themselves would be the leaders. Now, in the later sections of the Republic, he has a little bit more to say that's positive about their motivation. And these are the first group of people that we treat, since they're the first that comes up in your reading. These are the guardians. Now, the guardians in Plato's thought are often called philosopher kings. And as a matter of fact, in a really shorthand, Plato is usually identified, his political thought is usually identified with the idea that philosopher kings should be the rulers of society. So as you think about these guardians, we can also identify them with the philosopher. We can identify them with that character that left the cave and was able to see the form of the good, able to gain true knowledge and return in order to help other people out. These are the philosophers. These are the guardians. So what characterizes the guardians? Well, they are motivated for the pursuit of knowledge. Knowledge is what they desire most in life. And their life is characterized by that. So you might say that the primary faculty that drives them is their reason. Their reason is what pursues knowledge. It's the thing in everyone, thought Plato, that pursues knowledge is your reason. And so they want to pursue knowledge. Now we can see why this would be a bit in tension with their roles as rulers of the society, because in order to rule society, they're going to have to focus a lot on placing other people into the order of society, which is not an activity of gathering knowledge, but is instead an activity of putting knowledge into effect. They gain the knowledge of what proper order is, and they put it into effect by ordering other people. So they come to know what's good, and then they give rules about what's good to the society. Now, Plato then has a kind of positive motivation for these people. He also says that they will be the people that are in some sense most motivated by the good of the society itself. They will identify themselves with the good of the society. Presumably, knowing the good leads to identifying with the good. And this means that they will never fall to those vices that we saw before. The vice of greed, certainly, but the vice of ambition as well. They will never turn to selfish concerns of gathering honor for themselves or gathering material goods for themselves, and that will fall to other classes of people. Now, in order to keep these people pure, we remember that Plato thought that material goods, at least for the most moral, the most just of society, represent a kind of temptation, because it distracts them from focusing on the form of the good and focusing on knowledge. So Plato suggests that in order to form these people and keep them with their good character, we should in fact make sure that they don't have any material goods. They should in fact live at the very basic level of property. They should only have what is absolutely necessary for themselves to live, and we shouldn't have them owning anything beyond that, because this would only distract them and corrupt their character. Another piece that's important, perhaps in relation to our question of equality, is Plato's treatment here of males and females, because he stands a bit outside of the normal tradition of the ancient world in suggesting that males and females, although individually might be better or worse than each other in terms of capacities, are not better or worse than each other necessarily in terms of their gender itself. So he suggests that it's perhaps even possible that you will have male and female guardians. We might need to change the usual trope by which Plato is recognized. He doesn't just think that there will be philosopher kings, but he imagines that there would be philosopher queens. Now, Plato's not entirely consistent about his views of males and females across all of his work. But in the Republic, he does take a remarkably egalitarian approach, that means an incredibly equal approach, to males and females in terms of their potential capacities. So this will set him a bit outside the norm, and it does say something about the way that Plato, with the idea of focusing on the abstract notion of the form of the good, is willing to challenge the most basic traditions of human society in light of that ideal that stands in some ways outside of society, that you wouldn't have without the unique view of the philosopher. Okay, so these will be the guardians. But there are other levels that we need to pay attention to as well. For instance, there are those that started off that we might have thought were going to be guardians, but they didn't quite keep up with the rigorous standards that we had in terms of expecting that guardians will not be concerned about any other goods. So those that might be distracted by honors, those that might turn to think of themselves every once in a while in order to focus on gaining the honor themselves, those, although we start to raise them with the guardians, will recognize that they aren't quite of the level of the guardians. So we should separate them off and make a second class of people. These will be the auxiliaries, and they will function as the police force and the army, the generals for this society, this perfect society. Now, in contrast to the guardians, the auxiliaries won't be motivated primarily by their concern for knowledge, although they're a little bit concerned for knowledge. That doesn't become the primary thing they're worried about. They are driven primarily by their concern for honor. So they represent a little bit of the vice of ambitiousness. But this is okay, because they are driven by their spirit, or in Greek, their thumos, which is what gives them the ability to go out and fight, this kind of courage, this kind of intense bravery that makes them worried about honor even more than themselves. We can think about them as arranged much as an army is or a football team is, where you're concerned about your ability to make the play, your ability to come back with the record. Concerned about that much more than, say, money in this case. I guess it's an amateur football team that we're concerned with. But they're out there for the honor, for their ability to be recognized by the rest of the society as great. So they're not as concerned with material goods, although they have to have some material goods in order to keep going. They will participate in that culture much more than the guardians do, who are set apart from material culture. But the auxiliaries are primarily moved by their concern for honor. Now, there's a third group, and I'll bet by this point you can guess who they are. They are the producers. Now, we've noted that there are the three different motivations for people, and we've taken care of the motivation for knowledge that rules the guardians, the motivation focusing on honor, which motivates the auxiliaries, and now we're down to the motivation of concern for material goods, which motivates the producers. So if the producers are to be linked with a particular vice, it is the vice of greed. And this is why the producers need to be kept under control a bit by the rest of the members of the society. The producers will be given the function of working with material goods. They will be the blue-collar workers, those that go and work with their hands, the artisans, the people who run businesses. So we can think of anybody whose main focus is in economics, and economic production will be a member of the producer. So it doesn't just mean the working class. It can be owners of shops. It can be a CEO of a business, as we would think about it today. Wealthy people would be amongst the producers. The main distinguishing mark of the producer is that they are motivated by what Plato will call their appetites primarily. Their appetites, which drive them towards material goods, physical goods, the goods of house, shelter, food, sex. These are the kinds of things that will motivate producers. But note they're the furthest away from being motivated by knowledge and a perception of the good in the abstract. So we probably shouldn't trust the producers very far. Now remember, here again, we see Plato's suspicion of an appreciation of what's material, a suspicion of the appetites which lead you towards physical and material goods. He doesn't think that we can really trust the producers with what's going on. Now, as you look at society, there's also a hierarchy in terms of the number of people that will be in these. The producers will be the majority of people in the society, but they must occupy the lowest level of society because they must be controlled and limited by the groups that are above them. The auxiliaries, who come above them, will be the enforcers of society. They will be the ones who hear the rules and put them into practice, make sure that the producers and other auxiliaries are following the rules of society. The rules of society then will be produced by the smallest group of people, who will be the guardians, those philosopher kings and philosopher queens who have knowledge of the true good and are able to sort society out and provide it with rules for goodness. They're able to put everyone in their own place. Now, at this point, we should say something about the individual and the common good. Again, here we have a massive breakdown between Plato's view of the world and the modern view of the world. So the modern view of the world tends to start with individuals and what individuals want when starting to think about political society. This is a shift in political philosophy that we will see come along with the advent of modernity when we get to Machiavelli somewhat, but really kicking off by the time we get to Thomas Hobbes. So starting with individuals will come along later in the course. Plato doesn't start with an individual. Plato assumes that individuals are shaped by other people and by their own societies. We can remember back to that place of the cave where even the one who got to escape had to be freed from his bonds, had to be dragged up towards knowledge in order to get there. In order to become good people, in order to find out our place, our proper place in society, we will need to learn what that place is. And in part, it's our society that shapes us for that and prepares us to play our role in society. And our role in society is to contribute to the common good in that way that is most appropriate for us. Not in the way that we want to contribute to society. As a matter of fact, Plato would say that would be a horrible way to organize society. Imagine that I decided to contribute to society as an opera singer. I just want to be an opera singer. Now, the fact that I don't have a capacity to be an opera singer, I'm not worried about that. I think, well, maybe if I try it long enough, maybe if I go at this long enough, I'll figure it out, right? But if we ran it that way, if we ran that people could do whatever they wanted to do, we would end up wasting money on my education, wasting my education on me, and I would never become the great opera singer that I want to become. And so I would never be able to contribute to the society, right? Now, Plato thinks that's a horribly inefficient way to organize society around people's wants. We should instead organize society around people's capacities and put them in the role in which they will be able to contribute the most to the common good. So the common good of the society for Plato comes about when everyone is contributing first. Here we could think about the famous claim by John Kennedy, JFK. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Service comes before your your interior wants, your desires. And this is true for every member of the society. Every member is to contribute to the society. The society, in most ways, comes before the individual in Plato's thought. Now, in order to secure this, in order to secure the common good, Plato suggests that it might be necessary to tell the members of the society what would be called, in your translation, it's called the royal lie, but in most translations it's called the noble lie. So he thinks that he and his compatriots, if they were to set up this society, might need to teach a story to the members of the society. Now, this story would take a while to take place because the first generation that hears it might not believe it, but he thinks the second generation would finally take to it and accept it. It's interesting, he doesn't exactly say that this will be a lie that the guardians tell. As a matter of fact, he thinks that maybe even the guardians will believe it themselves in this perfect society. This noble lie takes the place of what Karl Marx will later call an ideology, a story, a narrative that gives you a set of values that hold up the order and structure of the society. Now, Karl Marx will later say that every society has a particular ideology, a kind of story that it tells to itself about why it exists as it does and why it must exist as it does. These ideologies are produced, he says, not just by the kind of most powerful to hold on to their position, but societies are structures that tend to support themselves. And so he wouldn't be at all surprised that Plato, this philosopher who's exploring this society, would produce a narrative that's meant to create an account of why the society is the way that it is and why it must be the way that it is for the members of the society to believe. So what is the noble lie? Well, Plato says that you should tell the members of the society that even before they were born, they were forged of the earth. So they were made of different elements, different kinds of metals, right? So he says the guardians were forged of gold, and this made them the particular people they are with the particular qualities that they have. And so this is their essence. This is essential to them. They cannot be anything other than guardians. And the auxiliaries ought to be told that they were forged with silver, so that who they are, their motivations are essential to themselves, and they could be no different. And then those who are the producers ought to be told that they are made of bronze or iron, that they are forged of these other metals. And so each one is made of a different kind of metal. Now they are all metal, and so they are meant to go together in the society. They are meant to, in some sense, be in a common project, that common project of the Republic. But on the other hand, they're different kinds of metals. And so each one should fulfill its own particular part in the society. This is what the gods have made them for, and this is what they are essentially set apart for, their own roles in society. Now, Plato says this is, in fact, the virtuous city that he's laid out. And as a matter of fact, we could say that this city, the order that he's laid out, is itself justice. In your reading, he suggested that justice is, in some sense, everyone doing their own part, everyone fulfilling their own role, not pursuing their own desires beyond their own place, but everyone fulfilling their own part in society. So justice is the overall virtue, but we also have virtues that pertain to the different parts of the society as we go. We can say that the wisdom of the society is in the guardians ruling. So that the guardians who have knowledge, who pursue it with their reason, they provide the wisdom of the society if everyone in the society listens to the rules that they give. The auxiliaries provide the courage of the society. They are the ones who must be brave, or the bravery of the society in its own defense and in enforcing the order provided by the guardians. The producers of the society then must represent the moderation or the temperance of the society, because they must moderate their desires for these material goods in order to do the work necessary to produce the goods that keeps the society going. All of these together make up the justice of the society, the order of the whole. So, if someone were to ask you on an exam about the virtues of the city, you would definitely want to say something about how virtue represents order and how the order is cashed out in terms of these particular virtues. The virtue or characteristic of wisdom, the virtue or characteristic of courage, the virtue or characteristic of moderation, and the virtue or characteristic of justice itself, which entails all of the above. This, Plato says, is the ideal republic. This is the republic of excellence. Now, by telling us about the republic of excellence, he can also tell us about particular other ways of setting up republics and governments, ways that are not virtuous, but vicious. So in each of the vicious versions of government that Plato tells us about, who's in charge of the republic shifts around to one of the other classes of society. And this tells you the kind of viciousness that the republic or the government or the society that is set up that way will manifest. Here he lays out 4 different kinds of vicious government. The first happens when the guardians are displaced and the auxiliaries take over the state. Now, what would a state be like if it were taken over by auxiliaries? Well, we remember that the auxiliaries are motivated primarily by their want for honor. And so they would set up a state, a society, that was focused primarily upon the kinds of activities and characteristics that gain people honor. They would want everyone to be brave in the society, and they would want everyone to be a type of warrior. Now, we could think about this kind of like if a society were set up by a group of warriors, and this wasn't abstract for Plato. He could look over at Sparta, right? If you're familiar with Sparta, there was a great documentary about them a few years ago. It was called The 300. It's not really a documentary. It's actually a screenplay based on a comic. But in any case, it gets the basic values correct. So at the beginning, we could say one of the myths of Sparta is that they took their children and they put them out in the wilderness when they were young to see if they could survive on their own in the midst of all the animals, if they could fight and defend themselves. So those children that died in the wilderness were not in fact good enough for the society, but those who fought and survived and were able to return to the city were in fact those who would rise up to be members of the society, which was a militaristic society, always on the face of war, always on a war setting, always prepared for that and looking out for that. So they don't develop the elements of culture or the focus on knowledge that Athens eventually developed. Now, Plato wants to say, well, is this the kind of society that you really want to live in? I don't think so. I think that's a kind of vicious society, one that doesn't run by the proper ordering, the proper values that we want in a society. If it becomes the case that the auxiliaries fall, they will fall to the demos, the people in some way, a popular uprising of the producers. And the producers can take multiple forms of leadership, all having to do with their desires for wealth, their desires for physical goods, their base desire for life above all else. The first form that Plato thinks this government will take is the form of an oligarchy. Now, an oligarchy is a generic word meaning a rule of a minority, but has generally become associated with a vicious rule of a minority. A rule of the minority that rule the society for themselves rather than for the good of the society. In Plato's view, the first thing that the producers might do is elect those who make the most money to run the government. And here we can think about, again, the story of the cave, where those at the bottom of the cave decided to elect representatives, to elect those who they gave honors to, and they elected those who were able to see the shadows the most clearly, which doesn't make any sense. So Plato thinks that what people will often do is they will decide that they want to be led by the most wealthy. And so the oligarchs will run the society not in order even to produce the most for the whole of society, but in order to become more wealthy themselves. This will happen over time, and eventually things will become corrupt, and we could see the oligarchs lose their place, as there is another popular uprising, at which point Plato fears that the producers might turn to democracy. Now, again, we tend to think of democracy as a good thing. Democracy is a world in which people are pursuing what they want, and they vote on that basis, and maybe we produce a society in which we all get together and we can all coexist in the midst of that. This, Plato said, would never work. It would never work because democracy is still based on these base desires. Everyone doing what they want instead of doing those capacities that contribute best to society. And so he feared that a democracy would simply be every person for themselves. There would be no common good. There would be no common project of the society. Everyone would pursue what they themselves desired, and there would be no coordination to the society. The entire structure of the society, he felt, would collapse over time as people fought with each other in order to get what they wanted instead of what someone else wanted. Without any sense of the common good, there would be no real state. There would be only chaos. And so finally we turn to the tyrant. In the midst of the anarchy of democracy, there would be one who would become the strongest leader. And that person would take over by force, and would force everyone else to follow that one person's commands. And that one person would rule society for their own good. This would be the tyrant. Now, no one underneath the tyrant would be happy because they would all exist to serve the tyrant. And the tyrant themselves, would they ever be happy? Well, they would create a society that is based on fear, on power, and on their ability to defeat others. So they themselves would never be safe. If anyone else became strong, they would lose their position to that person. So under the tyrant, there would be a society in which no one would be happy. Neither the people nor the ruler. It would be the most vicious of societies. Now, at this point, Plato is coming back to the original discussion with Thrasymachus. You will remember that Thrasymachus had posited that pure injustice would lead to happiness, while pure justice would lead to unhappiness. At this point, Plato has a political response to that, which is to say, in the purely unjust society, no one will be happy. But in the purely just society, well, it seems that, in some sense at least, everyone will be acting on that capacity that's most fit with themselves. Even the producers, while they might not be doing what they know is best for themselves, they might want to do something else, they'll be doing what is actually in their best interest. They will be doing the activity that most serves their best interest. Now, if this seems a strange idea that they could be informed of or might not know their best interest, think about this for a moment. So, social scientists tell us today that participating in social media actually makes us less happy as human beings. That there's a strict correlation between participation in social media and the rise of depression and anxiety in our society. The more we participate in that, and the less that we participate in embodied social relationships with other people, actually going to parties, interacting, having friends that you get together with, we'll tend to be less happy. But at the same time, none of this has stopped people from being more and more active on social media. So is it possible that what people want most is actually not what makes them most fulfilled, not what leads to their long-term happiness? Well, this is kind of the thing that Plato thought, that in some sense at least, the producers are actually the most fulfilled as possible for their lives in being producers. The auxiliaries are actually fulfilling their highest function in being auxiliaries. And the guardians are fulfilling their highest function in being guardians, even if it's not exactly what they want either, because they would like to be freed from this to pursue knowledge. So in some sense, in Plato's just society, everyone is happy. They're doing their appropriate thing, and they find their place. As long as they follow the rules of the guardian, at least, we produce what is, in some sense, a happy society. Now, there's some qualifications to this that are going to be significant. And these come about when we transfer from politics to the question of the individual, from the just political society to the just individual, and we look at the parallel between the ordering of those two. And we'll have to get into that in order to see where that breaks down. For right now, I'll stop and I'll put a break in this lecture. You, of course, are free to go on to the next lecture whenever you want, but get up at least, get yourself a stretch, get yourself something to eat, take a break from philosophy for a moment, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the individual and justice for the individual in Plato's Republic. Back in a minute.